The sun was already warming up the streets of Los Angeles when the first group of workers arrived at a massive construction site. The project was huge, a new convention center funded by foreign investors with strict deadlines. Amid the noise of machines and the fresh smell of concrete mix, Filipino workers moved with quiet discipline. Among them was Mang Ernesto, an older man, his hair white, his hands calloused. He didn't talk much, but when his hands moved, everyone paid attention. You could learn just by watching him. He didn't wear a watch. Time for him was measured by the sun's angle, the weight of the bucket, the feel of the ground. Every movement he made had rhythm. Like a quiet dance repeated so many times, it became second nature. The younger workers looked at him like a teacher. The older ones, like a peer who had earned his place. Someone once said he used to build bridges in the province with just a rope and his eyes. He had no diploma, but what he knew came from years of sweat, scaffolding, and silent prayers. One morning, a new face arrived. Black car, white shirt, tablet in hand. It was Mr. William Hart, an American engineer sent by the company to organize the mess. He spoke quickly, walked straight, and clearly wasn't used to dust. When he saw the workers, mostly Filipinos, sweaty but focused, his expression tightened. To him, technical knowledge was everything. And when he noticed Mang Ernesto, he assumed he was just another common laborer. Hart wasted no time. He called the foreman, gathered the leads, and announced a new policy. No excuses. Every measurement must be exact. I don't want stories, just results. Silence followed. One foreman tried to explain that the old workers like Ernesto had reliable methods, but Hart interrupted. This isn't some rural village. We're building modern infrastructure. The air grew heavy. Ernesto said nothing. He simply wiped his hands with the cloth at his waist and returned to mixing cement. A few hours later, Hart stopped in front of a newly built wall. He stared at it carefully. "Who built this?" he asked. A hand rose. "Mang Ernesto's team, sir." Hart smirked. "Seriously? It's slanted. The mix is dry. That corner is a mess." He called everyone over, trying to humiliate Ernesto. "So this is what you call experience?" Ernesto stepped forward. Quiet. He looked at the wall and said, "This wall will last longer than your arrogance." The entire site fell silent. Hart's eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" Ernesto didn't respond. "You want to prove yourself?" Hart asked, voice louder now. He looked around. "Tomorrow morning you'll build a structure from this blueprint, alone. No help, no shortcuts." Everyone froze. Ernesto simply nodded. "I'll be here." Hart turned his back, thinking he'd already won, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. The rest of the day was quiet. The younger workers whispered, "Can Mang really do it? That engineer is rude." The older one simply said, "Wait." At his boarding room, Ernesto washed his hands. His joints ached, but they were steady. He looked at an old photo hanging on the wall. Himself, younger, beside a mentor with a white hard hat. "Tomorrow isn't just a wall," he whispered. "It's a reminder." And he went to bed. Before the sun even rose, people were already arriving. It was Saturday, but it felt like a feast day. A spot had been roped off where the challenge would happen. At exactly 7 o'clock, Hart arrived. Neat, polished shoes, tablet in hand. "Where's the concrete master?" he joked. But Ernesto was already there, standing at the center of the site. No drama, just his gloves and tools. He accepted the blueprint, nodded, and began preparing the mix. Hart crossed his arms. Behind him, a group of young engineers whispered, "He's going to mess it up. He'll break down before lunch." Ernesto heard them, but he said nothing. He adjusted the mix, perfect ratio. He didn't look around. He focused on levels, lines, and the sky. He knew exactly what he was doing, not to prove a point, to remind people, each block, each string, like a dance from the province, with rhythm in the air and truth in every motion. By mid-morning, the structure was halfway done, not finished, but solid. Hart walked over with his tablet, checked every corner, measured, studied the surface. He found nothing, no cracks, no flaws. He said nothing. Ernesto sat in the shade, drinking from an old bottle, quietly watching. That wall, simple as it was, said something, not to him, to everyone who had been overlooked. Today, they were finally seen. By the next morning, something felt different at the site. People moved the same, but there was a calm in the air. No one talked much about the previous day, but everyone remembered. Even the foreman walked more softly. Hart didn't come down early as usual. He stayed in his office, quietly watching a video someone had sent him. It was footage of Ernesto working, steady, focused, graceful. The video already had thousands of views, comments in English, Tagalog, Spanish. This man is a legend. This is art. Hart turned off the screen. He didn't understand why it bothered him so much. Inside the office, he paced restlessly. Something about the old builder unsettled him. Hart had faced architects, contractors, even arrogant managers, but none made him feel like this. Ernesto didn't argue, didn't challenge him, and still, he disrupted everything. It was like looking in a mirror and not liking what you saw. Finally, Hart called for a file. "Get me everything on that old man. Real name, history, anything strange." The assistant returned with a brown envelope, simple records inside, but among them was a sheet stamped red, confidential. The paper read, "Restricted access, government project, sudden resignation, false name declared." Hart frowned. False name. He flipped the sheet and read handwritten notes, millimetric precision, non-standard techniques, no academic trace. Something didn't make sense. Or maybe it made too much sense. He went to the company archive, dug through old files. He found an image, a narrow but strong bridge built over a fast river in the Philippines. Caption, "Unknown builder. Structure completed in record time using unconventional methods." Next to it, a black and white photo, a young man with familiar eyes. Hart held the photo for a long time. No printed name, just handwriting on the back. Ernesto de la Cruz, the man who measured with his eyes. It was him, but it couldn't be. This was decades ago. How could no one know? How could a man like that vanish into obscurity? Hart stared at the picture in silence. His world of spreadsheets and formulas began to shake. Could it be that all his training, his titles and certifications meant less than a well-laid wall? Still, he couldn't accept it. He had to test Ernesto again, this time with witnesses. That afternoon, he gathered the supervisors. "We'll begin laying the foundation of the main auditorium this week, and I want Mr. Ernesto to lead it." Alone, with outside evaluators present, shock rippled through the team. Eyes turned to the old man. He simply nodded. "I accept." Hart smirked. This time Ernesto would be under pressure, measured, watched. No room for legend, just proof. Ernesto asked one thing. When? Hart replied, "Tomorrow." Silence again. The younger workers whispered, "He's gonna fail." But the older ones knew. Ernesto never accepted a challenge unless he'd already won it in his mind. Meanwhile, the video of Ernesto kept spreading. Builders, engineers, even artists were sharing it. A Filipino professor at UCLA posted, "This man is a living heritage. Someone protect him." Hart read that and almost threw his phone. But something inside him paused. He was starting to admire Ernesto, even while resisting it. He remembered his father, a retired engineer, once saying, "The best builders I met didn't know how to sign their names, but their walls stood for generations." Hart never took that seriously, until now. That evening, Adrian saw Ernesto still walking around the site, alone. He tapped the ground with his boots, almost like he was listening. He carried a bubble level, a piece of string and a wooden measuring stick, nothing digital. Before leaving, he knelt, traced a small symbol in the soil, and whispered words in Tagalog. A quiet prayer, not asking to win, asking for strength, for honor, for the memory of who he was and always had been. At sunrise, Hart arrived first. This time, no blazer, just a white shirt and work boots. Something had shifted in him. He walked softer. The workers noticed. Ernesto arrived soon after, greeted no one, but nodded respectfully. The site was marked. The evaluators were there, a renowned Filipino engineer, an American executive, and an independent architect. Ernesto read the blueprint, looked at the earth, and nodded. Then he began. The foundation was complex, precise cuts, perfect ratios, measured spacing. Ernesto didn't hesitate. He dug with grace, measured by step and feel, adjusted levels with his old bubble tool. The evaluators began writing notes, but soon they just watched. His movements had rhythm, its living geometry, the architect murmured. Hart listened quietly. For the first time, he wasn't angry. He was curious. How did Ernesto see what others missed? How could he sense curves that weren't drawn, measures that weren't marked? He wasn't just a laborer. Maybe he was something more. Hours passed. Workers slowly drifted over. Some brought materials, others pretended to check tools, but all were watching. Ernesto moved like always, quiet, deliberate. Every tap of the trowel, every lift of the bucket felt like part of a silent song. Hart stood there, arms crossed, deeply focused. He began to understand. This wasn't luck, it wasn't magic. It was science lived through decades, and now embodied in a man no one respected. Around noon, Ernesto asked for water, sat beneath a scaffold. Hart joined him, said nothing at first, then asked, "Who taught you?" Ernesto looked at the sky. "My father," and he learned from his father, and his father, from the earth. Hart nodded. He didn't fully understand, but he felt it. There was wisdom here, not in books but in footsteps, in wait, in knowing when to listen. By day's end, the foundation was done, not just acceptable, perfect. The evaluators clapped quietly. One of them said, "It's like he sees the blueprint before drawing it." Hart heard this and swallowed hard, then walked to the center, knelt and ran his hand across the surface. Smooth, solid, alive. He looked up. Ernesto was already walking away. Hart wanted to call out, to thank him, to say something. But the words never came. That night, Hart opened his father's old photo album, found a picture, workers posing at a finished build. In the corner, a man with gray hair held a trowel. It was Ernesto. Same eyes, same helmet. The back of the photo read, "The man who taught without words." Hart didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but now he knew, and the question was, what would he do with the truth? The following days were intense. Construction of the new structure, named the Living Memory Space, was set to begin in a week. Hart announced that volunteers would form the team. "If anyone wants to learn from Mang Ernesto, report by tomorrow." He expected a few, maybe one or two, but the next morning half the site was in line. Adrian was first. "Even just watching him is enough," he said. Hart stood quietly in the distance. He saw something unexpected. This wasn't a crew. It was a class. And the quiet man was their teacher. Preparations began early. Ernesto reviewed materials, marked the ground with the care of a craftsman. Adrian followed closely. "Why do you use chalk and not a laser?" he asked. Ernesto answered, "Chalk speaks, laser commands." Adrian didn't get it at first, but he wrote it down. With every movement, Ernesto wasn't teaching formulas, he was passing on sense. How to place your foot, how to hold the trowel, when to stop and listen to the silence of the cement. Hart watched, took notes. Leadership, he realized, wasn't shouting, it was presence. On the first day of construction, something unexpected happened. Workers from other sites arrived, Filipinos, Latinos, even a few Americans. "I saw the video," they said. "Can we help?" Hart hesitated. Ernesto nodded. "If your heart is clean, you can work." And so they did, silently, steadily. It wasn't a sight anymore. It was almost a ritual. Hart, for the first time, felt he was witnessing something sacred. By the end of the day, he raised his head and saw a perfectly drawn foundation. He looked at Ernesto and thought, how can someone invisible become unforgettable? That afternoon, Hart got a call. It was from a local TV station. "We want to interview Mang Ernesto. He's gone viral. The public wants to know who he is." Hart sighed. He doesn't want fame. He just wants to build. The reporter insisted, but Hart refused. Later, he told Ernesto about it. The old man smiled softly. "When you build a house, it doesn't need to say who built it. It just needs to stand." Hart wrote that down. It wasn't just wisdom. It was philosophy. He was beginning to understand. Greatness doesn't make noise. It leaves roots. The next morning, a group of architecture students came to the site. They had heard about the project and wanted to observe. Hart allowed it with one rule: don't interfere. Ernesto greeted them with a nod and kept working. One of the students asked, "Sir, how do you measure the exact depth?" Ernesto replied, "With my feet." The student laughed, thinking it was a joke. But Ernesto explained, "I step and listen. If the ground sinks, it's not ready. If it stays firm, it's right." The students went silent. They realized some measurements aren't found on rulers, they're found in feel. By the end of the week, half the structure was standing. One wall, made from reused stone, stood out for its beauty. The architect who had once dismissed Ernesto returned to the site. She stood silently for a long time. Then she said to Hart, "This isn't construction, it's raw art." Hart nodded. "Yes, it is." Ernesto kept working as if nothing had changed, but something had. Inside him, a quiet peace was growing. For the first time, he felt he wasn't just laying bricks. He was planting something that would last beyond him. But not everyone was happy. Some younger supervisors, graduates of prestigious schools, started to whisper, "He's going to make us look outdated." One of them, Julian, approached Hart. "Aren't you worried about promoting non-technical methods?" Hart answered calmly, "I'm more worried about ignoring methods that have worked for centuries." Julian stayed quiet, but walked away, clearly displeased. The tension grew. Ernesto sensed it, but said nothing. He knew ego was fragile, and unlike concrete, it couldn't be reinforced with time, only humility. One afternoon, a rumor spread. An anonymous complaint had been filed to upper management. It claimed the project wasn't following proper codes. Hart received the memo. He was furious, but knew he needed proof. He gathered records, videos, measurements. He showed everything to the board. Every part was validated. "This is more precise than many digital blueprints." The board hesitated, then allowed the project to continue under supervision. Hart told Ernesto. The old man simply replied, "A straight wall defends itself," and went back to work as if nothing could touch him, as if he had expected this all along. The next morning, workers noticed Ernesto was quieter than usual. He looked tired. Adrian approached. "Mang, are you okay?" Ernesto smiled. "The foundation is firm. Now it's your turn." Adrian was surprised. "You're stepping back?" Ernesto didn't answer. He just pointed to the top of the structure. "See how it already casts shade." Then he lifted another bucket. It was his way of saying the essential was already done. But something in his tone felt like farewell, like he knew the project was reaching a new point. That afternoon, a veteran engineer from headquarters, arrived. His name was Donald Reyes, American, but of Filipino roots. Hart knew him by reputation, one of the company's top structural minds. Reyes walked the site, touched the beams, spoke with the workers. Then he asked to speak with Ernesto. "I've heard of you for years. I never thought you were real." Ernesto smiled. "I never wanted to be found." Reyes chuckled. "And yet, here you are." Then he said something unexpected. "I want this structure to be included in our official training manual." Hart was speechless. Ernesto simply nodded. That evening, Hart climbed to the roof of a nearby building. He wanted to see the structure from above. As he looked down, his throat tightened. It wasn't the height, it was the view. Every line, every corner seemed to speak. The symmetry was natural, alive. Ernesto sat below on his usual bench. Hart pulled out his phone, snapped a picture, and saved it under one word: learning. For the first time, he didn't see himself as a manager. He saw himself as a student, and that was a new kind of strength. That night, he received a letter from his father. The old man had heard about the project. "Son, they say someone reminded you what matters. Remember that old worker who visited us when you were a boy? That was him. Mang Ernesto. You didn't recognize him, but he was always nearby. He's the one who taught you to measure with your eyes when you couldn't even read." Hart wept quietly. That was the missing piece. Now everything made sense, and it was time to honor it. The next morning, Hart arrived earlier than anyone else. He sat on Ernesto's bench and waited. When the old man arrived, he was surprised. "You're starting early today?" he joked. Hart smiled. "Today, I came to learn." He handed over his father's letter. Ernesto read it in silence. His eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "Your father was a good man, and so are you, but only if you keep your feet on the ground." Hart nodded. In that moment, they were no longer engineer and laborer. They were just men, united by concrete, by time, by something greater. Meanwhile, Adrian was organizing tools. He looked at the two men and thought, this is how legacy begins, not with shouting but with presence. He grabbed his notebook and wrote, "Today I learned that some walls rise inside us." Ernesto saw him writing and smiled. Writing is good, but only those who lift build. Adrian stood and went back to work. He felt different, as if he were part of something historical. And he was. What started as a humiliation was now becoming a symbol. But something else was coming. At lunchtime, everyone gathered under the nearly finished structure. They ate together, laughed, shared stories. Hart stood and raised a cup to wisdom not found in books, but in the eyes of those who've lived it. Everyone applauded, but while the mood was light, Julian, the bitter engineer, stepped away. He made a phone call. "He needs to be removed, or he'll outshine everything we've done." A voice replied, "We have a way." The celebration continued, but in the shadows, a plan was taking shape, and no one saw it coming. The next morning, a truck unloaded new materials, but something felt off. Some of the cement bags had different labels. Hart noticed. "Who approved this delivery?" he asked. One of the crew answered, "It's signed by Engineer Julian." Hart frowned. Ernesto also stepped forward. He tore open one of the bags, smelled the mix and muttered, "This is weak. It'll crack." Hart ordered the batch to be discarded, but it was already too late. One wall made with that cement began showing small fractures. Word spread fast. It was the perfect excuse for doubters to question Ernesto's methods, and that's exactly what they did. Julian acted quickly. He gathered managers, showed pictures of the cracked wall, and implied that Ernesto's old-fashioned ways had compromised structural safety. "We need standards, not sentiment," he declared. The board, worried about public image, ordered an inspection. Hart tried to explain the real cause, but they silenced him. Let the evidence speak. When Ernesto was informed, he simply nodded. The truth shows itself, even in the smallest crack. But inside, he felt something heavier. Not fear, just sadness. Even after all this, some still chose noise over wisdom. The next day, the site was partially shut down. Sensors were installed. Experts walked around, measuring depths, checking levels, inspecting angles. Hart followed the team, trying to stay calm. Ernesto stood back, saying nothing. Adrian approached him. "Are you worried, sir?" Ernesto replied, "Not worried, just tired. Tired of building with care and being torn down by people who never laid a single brick." Hart heard that. Something broke inside him. For the first time, he wanted to protect Ernesto, not as a boss, but as a son protects his father. But he knew the truth had to be undeniable. Later that afternoon, one technician found something strange. All the cracks were in areas where the off-brand cement was used. Hart wasted no time. He pulled out receipts, matched them with delivery logs. They don't match. He brought the evidence to the board. Ernesto stood beside him silently. The investigation intensified. Julian was questioned. He hesitated, made excuses. But the facts were too clear. Sabotage. Not just an attempt to ruin Ernesto, but a scheme involving fake purchases. Julian was immediately dismissed. The project was cleared to resume. But the emotional damage was done. Even proven innocent, Ernesto seemed quieter than ever. That evening, Hart visited Ernesto at his small rented room. He brought a toolbox, brand new, as a gift. But when he arrived, he found Ernesto just sitting there, staring at the ceiling. "I knew you'd come," the old man said. Hart sat down. "I'm sorry, I should have stopped this." Ernesto looked him in the eyes. "You can't stop the wind, but you can teach others how to build better." They sat in silence for several minutes. Then Ernesto opened the box, pulled out one of the tools and said, "This one doesn't weigh much, feels like it's built to last." Just like him. The next day, everyone returned to work. Hart called a meeting. He climbed onto a steel drum and spoke firmly. "Someone tried to sabotage this project. They failed. And if it happened, it's because some people fear what they don't understand." He turned to Ernesto. "This man built more than walls. He built trust. And that's something no scandal can break." The workers clapped. Ernesto stood still, but deep inside something softened. He felt less alone now. His way of building had finally found echo, and it wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone. Later that day, Adrian approached. "Mang, can I ask something?" Ernesto nodded. "Have you ever thought about quitting?" The old man smiled. "Every day. But then I remember, when we stop building, everything around us starts to fall, even inside us." Adrian nodded. "If you stop, it'll feel like we lost a pillar." Ernesto chuckled. "Then I guess I'd better keep going." But deep down, he knew. The time was coming. Not to stop, but to pass it on. His role now was to train new hands, sharpen new eyes, and steady new hearts. News of the sabotage spread quickly, but alongside it came something else. The company officially recognized Ernesto's method as a reference for special projects. Management even announced it would be included in their training curriculum. Hart proposed something bolder, a learning module titled Living Geometry, inspired by Ernesto's practices. At first, Ernesto resisted. "I'm not a teacher," he said. But later he agreed on one condition. The first exercise must be building a wall using only a string, a plumb line, and silence. Everyone laughed, but they knew he wasn't joking. It was his way of saying, "Learn to feel." The next morning, something unusual happened. A group of children, sons and daughters of the workers, visited the site. Their school had arranged a field trip to see where their parents worked. Ernesto was asked to guide them. He hesitated, then agreed. He walked slowly, explaining in simple words. Every wall is like a promise. If you rush it, it'll break. A young girl raised her hand. Have you ever broken one? Ernesto smiled. Yes, outside and inside. But I learned you can always rebuild. The kids gathered around him. It was like listening to a grandfather, and in a way they were. At lunch, Hart brought Ernesto a box. Inside were old documents, newspaper clippings, even a medal from a national construction contest in the Philippines. I found these in a forgotten archive, Hart said. Ernesto looked through them quietly. He picked up the medal. I turned this down once. Hart asked, why? Ernesto replied, because I didn't want to become a memory. I wanted to remain in motion. Hart reflected. Today, you're both. The old man laughed. Then maybe I'll accept it, if I can still mix cement. They shook hands, not as boss and worker, but as men of the trade. That afternoon, the nearly finished site received an unexpected visitor. A journalist had heard about Mang Ernesto. I want to understand how someone builds with such precision without electronics. Hart replied, he doesn't build with his hands. He builds with his soul. The journalist asked for an interview. Ernesto agreed, under one condition. No name, no photo. Talk about the work, talk about the story, leave me out. The journalist was puzzled but agreed. Ernesto turned to Hart. What matters is what stands, not who stands in the picture. And once again, he stepped quietly out of the spotlight. Just a few days later, the symbolic space was finished. It wasn't flashy. It was made of stone, soil, and cement. But it had presence, a stillness that spoke, a curve that embraced, a shadow that sheltered. Hart asked Ernesto to give the opening speech. The old man declined. I've spoken with my hands. Now it's your turn. During the small ceremony, some of the older workers cried. Adrian carried a paper flower he'd made in tribute. At the corner of the structure, a simple plaque read, "To those who build with care." But one more surprise was still to come. By day's end, Hart received one last letter. It was from his father. Inside was a photo from years ago, a build site in the Philippines, a group of workers, and in the center, Mang Ernesto, young, holding a plumb line. On the back, it read, "This man taught me more than any university. Honor him, son." Hart brought the photo to Ernesto. The old man studied it. That was the school wall I built when I first learned to read. Hart said nothing. Ernesto smiled. And now you've learned how to listen. And with that, the old builder walked away, leaving a legacy that would never crack. The symbolic structure was inaugurated on a clear Saturday morning. No stage, no formal speeches, just workers, engineers, students, and families gathered in silence. There was something sacred in the air. A small bronze plaque was installed at the entrance. To those who build without needing to be seen. Hart walked among the guests with a soft smile. For the first time, he felt his job was to serve the project, not lead it. When he looked around for Ernesto, he couldn't find him. He asked Adrian, who pointed to the back of the yard. There he was, sitting under a tree, quietly watching. Hart approached and sat beside him. "Why aren't you with the others?" Ernesto replied, "The tree doesn't need to clap for the flower." Hart thought for a moment. But without the tree, the flower doesn't grow. Ernesto smiled. They sat silently, looking at the structure. A few children were playing nearby, carefully climbing the stone base. "It's solid," Ernesto said. "It won't fall," Hart answered. "Just like what you left here, They weren't just talking about the building, they were talking about legacy, about something deeper than bricks and mortar. At the end of the event, a company director asked Ernesto to pose for a photo with the team. He refused, but when he saw Adrian holding the paper flower in his hand, he changed his mind. Only if it's with those who touch the cement. The photo was taken. A few weeks later, it would appear in a global engineering magazine under the title, "The Man Who Built Without Signing Anything." The article went viral. Universities began using the story as case material. Ernesto didn't react. He kept waking up early, watering the plants at the boarding house and cleaning his trowel. Adrian was the first to notice the change. Ernesto started arriving later. He paused more, sat down more often. It wasn't weakness, it was transition. One day, Adrian approached. "I think it's time you let me try building on my own." Ernesto looked him in the eye. "It is." He handed him his oldest trowel. "It won't feel heavy if you remember why you're holding it." Adrian held it firmly. He felt something pass through his hands. It wasn't just a tool, it was a responsibility, a story, a quiet promise that would never be written, but always felt. The next morning, Adrian led the team. Hart stood at a distance, nervous, but everything went well. Measurements were exact, lines straight, angles perfect. At the end of the day, Ernesto walked over and said, "Didn't need to fix a thing. Now I can rest." Hart smiled. "Will you go home now?" Ernesto replied, "Home is wherever you build with love." That was his way of saying he was at peace. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. His teachings already lived in new eyes, new hands. The walls of his life were standing. All that was left was time. A few days later, Hart received an invitation to speak at a construction conference. Topic: Ancestral Wisdom in Modern Building. He thought about declining, but then had an idea. He called Adrian. "You're coming with me." Adrian was hesitant. "Me?" Hart replied. "You carry what matters. Mang Ernesto chose you." And so they went. On stage, Hart shared the story of the project. He showed pictures, told stories, moved the audience. At the end, he handed the mic to Adrian. His voice trembled. "I learned that building is more about listening than talking, and that sometimes silence is the best engineer." After the event, people gathered around Adrian. They wanted to learn more, visit the site, understand the methods. Adrian realized something. He now carried a responsibility. He returned to the site with new eyes. He began documenting everything. He created a notebook with sketches, quotes from Ernesto, and hands-on techniques. He titled it, "The Notebook of Hands." Hart read it and approved. "We should publish this." Adrian hesitated. "Only if he agrees." They went to the boarding house, found Ernesto tending to a basil plant. Hart explained the project. Ernesto thought for a moment, then said, "If it helps someone build with more care, then go ahead." The book was released 3 months later. It was an unexpected success. It caught the attention of universities in Asia, Europe, and Latin America. It didn't contain formulas or charts, just gestures, stories, glances, and a teaching on every page. The straightest line is the one drawn with intention. Ernesto didn't attend the launch, but he received a copy. He flipped through it silently, laughed softly at a photo of him placing bricks with a small child on his lap. It was Adrian years ago on a school visit. The cycle had come full circle. One day, Hart entered the company's main office and saw a new decoration, a wall with letters in forged iron that read, "To build is to love in silence." Below it, a small sign, "Tribute to Mang Ernesto." He touched the words with his fingers, felt a shiver, walked outside and headed to the construction yard. There he found Adrian teaching 2 new apprentices. He watched, smiling, then looked up and whispered, "He's still here." And he was. In every well-laid line, in every silent nod, in every moment, someone chose care over speed. Ernesto had become eternal without ever trying to. One afternoon, a group of engineers from Singapore visited the site. One of them asked, "Who designed this project?" Hart replied, "There's no architect, just a memory." They didn't understand at first, but as they walked through the space, they started to feel it. It was like being inside a prayer made of stone, as if someone had whispered something between the bricks. One of the visitors said, "I've never seen anything like this." Hart replied, "You won't. This doesn't repeat. It only lives once." The place became a destination, a living lesson. On his birthday, Hart received a call from his father. "So you finally understood," Hart replied. "I've learned that some walls hold more than roofs." His father laughed. "That's what I wanted you to learn years ago, but it took the old man to show it to you." Hart smiled. "Do you think he'll stop now?" His father answered, "He never stopped. He just changed walls, from concrete ones to the ones we carry inside." And with that, he hung up. Hart looked at a photo on his shelf, Ernesto smiling, pencil behind his ear. Behind him, the first wall of the project, still standing. Months passed. Adrian passed his foreman exam. Hart congratulated him with a gift, a handcrafted wooden ruler with the words, "Always measure twice, once with your eyes, once with your heart." Adrian teared up. "That was Mang Ernesto's line." Hart nodded. "Now it's yours." That ruler was used on the first project Adrian led, and in it, every worker received a small notebook of Ernesto's teachings. The seed had spread, not as a manual, but as a living inheritance. A reminder that concrete may crack, but a well-built legacy never does. Several months later, the school hosted a quiet tribute. No banners, no spotlight, but every seat was filled. Students, former workers, visiting families, all gathered. They weren't there to celebrate. They were there to thank him. Mang Ernesto had passed away just as he lived, quietly. There was no elaborate ceremony, no headlines, but every heart present carried his memory. The students built a small wall together. Each one laid a single brick. At the end, they carved one line, "Raised with longing, built with gratitude." Hart, now fully retired, watched from the back. He turned to Adrian. He left like the greatest works do, right on time, and what he left behind isn't just foundation. It's memory that doesn't show up on maps, but stays alive in people. Adrian nodded. They both knew. Some walls aren't made of stone, but of lessons. Mang Ernesto became a legend. Across different construction sites, his name began to spread. Sometimes in stories mixed with fiction, sometimes pure fact. But at the heart of every version was the same truth. A quiet old man who didn't just build walls. He shaped people. Some students called him the architect of the soul. But if you had asked him, he would have just said, "I'm a worker. I like mixing cement." One afternoon, a young engineer came to the school. She had questions about proper depth measurements. Adrian answered them all. When she left, he smiled. "She's got the touch. She just needs to listen more to what's not on the paper." He turned to the blackboard and wrote one of Ernesto's quotes. "Don't just listen to the hammer. Learn to hear the silence of what's right." And as he wrote it, he realized, the teacher doesn't need to be present. As long as the spirit remains, the teaching continues. In the back garden of the school, a small tree grew. Ernesto had planted it years ago with a child on his lap. Now, it provided shade. Children played there every day. At the start of each semester, Adrian gathered the new students under the tree. He told them the story of Ernesto. He showed them his old trowel. He read a passage from the Notebook of Hands. Then he'd say, "We're not here just to learn how to build. We're here to learn how to keep going, even when no one's watching." One day, the same journalist who once visited came back. He was searching for some kind of monument. but there were no statues, no bronze busts. Just messages carved into walls, a wooden bench, and an old plumb line displayed behind glass. When he left, he wrote an article titled, "The Quietest Name, the Loudest Echo." It went viral worldwide. But inside the school, nothing changed. There was still cement, still rhythm, still reverence, and still that presence, invisible but strong. During the closing ceremony of one class, Adrian read one final teaching from Ernesto. If you don't know where to start, look down. The ground will remind you where you came from and how much more you can raise. And that was the end of the lesson. No applause, no speeches, just silence. The kind of silence that Ernesto loved. One by one, the students exited, each holding a hollow block with their name engraved on it. It wasn't a graduation, it was a continuation, because at that school, no one ever finishes. They just keep walking, following the line, the weight, and the quiet. And every step they take still follows Mang Ernesto.